welcome to our first ever panel on careers in atrocity law and advocacy. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Professor Rajika Shah. I am the Deputy Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Genocide here at Loyola, and I also am the Clinical Director of the Loyola Genocide Justice Clinic. Joining us today are Kristen Nelson, Senior Counsel at Hecht Partners LLP, and Helen Worsnop, Senior Assistant Prosecutor at the UN Assistance to the Khmer Rouge Trials. I think before we begin, I just want to also let you know, for anybody who is a 2L or 3L, this week is also the week that we are recruiting for clinics for the spring. So if anybody is thinking about the Genocide Justice Clinic or maybe becomes interested in it as a result of this panel, we are hosting an open house for all of the clinics tomorrow outside Founders Hall from 12 to 1 p.m. and then again at 5 to 6 p.m. So please come on by, talk to us about the clinic. There'll be some current students there to answer any questions you might have as well about the clinic. And you can always email me. So with that, I think let's begin. I'm so excited to have Kristen and Helen here with us. I'm just going to give you a little bit of information on their background and then let them take it away from there. So Kristen Nelson, as I mentioned, is Senior Counsel at Hecht Partners LLP. She is a litigator with extensive experience in domestic and international atrocity litigation and asset recovery. She specializes in human rights and transnational litigation in U.S. courts and arbitration. Helen Worsnop is also with us today, live from Cambodia. Thank you, Helen, for joining us at this early morning hour for you. She is the Senior Assistant Prosecutor at the United Nations Assistance to the Khmer Rouge Trials. She has more than a decade of experience as a prosecutor with international criminal tribunals, including where she currently is. It's more commonly known by the name Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia. She also has worked at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and I think she's okay with me mentioning that she will soon be joining the Prosecutor's Office of the International Criminal Court. So we're very fortunate to have these two experienced lawyers here with us today. I think the first question I wanted to ask you, can you tell us just a little bit more about the atrocity-related work that you're doing currently in your current positions? What's your current work like? Maybe let's start with Kristen.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Shaw. A little bit odd for me to be calling you that because you have been my colleague for so many years, but I appreciate you inviting me to join this discussion this evening, or I think it's this afternoon for you. As you mentioned, I work for a law firm here in the United States. We call it kind of high impact litigation, and we focus on mostly class actions against sovereigns and corporate defendants for human rights abuses that have been committed outside of the United States. And pretty much for the last 2 years, I've worked exclusively on plaintiff side of civil litigation. So I don't do any criminal law, I don't do defense. These are plaintiff's cases, civil actions brought in US courts. And what does my work look like right now? In the past, it's focused on Armenian genocide and Holocaust era claims, but lately it's a singular focus on a case that alleges that one of the world's largest banks helped the Omar al-Bashir regime, this is a former regime in Sudan, commit human rights abuses by helping it get access to US dollars and access to financial markets in order to sell oil, raise money, buy weapons, and fund its militias in violation of US sanctions that were put in place in 1997. The sanctions were put in place in recognition of human rights abuses that were being committed by the Bashir regime against the civilian population, and they were being committed by the militia. You may have heard of the Janjaweed, security forces, the military, and the police. And interestingly, before this lawsuit was filed, the various departments of the US government, as well as state agencies, investigated this large French bank, BNP Paribas, for these violations of US sanctions. And they pled guilty and paid one of the largest criminal penalties ever. They paid almost $9 billion in recognition of the violation of US sanctions. And so we brought this class action. It's a putative class action against the bank in US courts for basically helping finance the al-Bashir's regime's atrocities against the civilian population. And it's been going on since 2016. We've made it through 3 motions to dismiss. We are we finished fact discovery. We are in expert discovery, and we will be briefing class cert and summary judgment sometime next year. And so that has been taking up all of my time over the last couple of years. And, we look forward to moving the case forward next year.
Fascinating. Thank you, Kristen. And Helen, would you tell us a little bit about your current work?
Of course. So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning from Phnom Penh in Cambodia. Yeah, so as Professor Shah said, I'm one of the prosecutors in the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. You heard I mention a UN entity as well. That's because this court is what's known as a hybrid court. So it was set up as a cooperation between the United Nations and the government of Cambodia. And it was set up specifically, and so this is the work I've been doing, to prosecute crimes, horrific crimes that took place between 1975 and 1979. So, well over 40 years ago now, here in Cambodia, when the Khmer Rouge were in power. Now, I'm sure many of you know, or all of you know, that the Khmer Rouge was sort of an ultra-Maoist communist regime that had actually been in control of large parts of Cambodia before that time, but took control in April 1975, following which they, the charges are genocide, crimes against humanity, and grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, because in a nutshell, they took over, they emptied the cities, there were forced evacuations, forced transfers around the country, and then they essentially enslaved the whole population. A slight generalization, but really not an exaggeration. They forced everyone to live in cooperatives. They, as I say, forced them to work in irrigation sites. They set up horrific prisons that they call security centers, the most famous of which, or infamous of which, is S21, which were essentially centers for torture and ultimately murder, executions. There's a lot more detail I could go into, but I won't now. So we prosecute the crimes that happened in that almost 4-year period. You may know, and Professor Shah mentioned I'm moving on, this court is now closing down, and tomorrow is a big day because we actually received the appeal judgment in case 2-2, which is the final case before the AdvocacyLLS. And that's the judgment now against only one individual, Khieu Samphan, who was the head of state during the Khmer Rouge regime. So we're waiting to hear what the Supreme Court chamber has to say tomorrow. But I've been here 8 years, and we've been prosecuting our way through all the cases that have been before this tribunal. I'm going to stop there because I could talk about this for days, and I won't.
Wonderful, thank you. For both of you, whichever one of you wants to jump in first, feel free. Is this the kind of work, what you're doing now, is this the kind of work you imagined you would be doing when you were in law school? The way our current law school participants are, If you think back to that time, was this where you thought you would be at this stage of your career?
I could certainly say definitely not. Sorry, I didn't. I didn't
Please
mean to
go ahead,
interrupt you.
Helen.
To give you a little bit of background, in the UK, which is obviously where I'm from, you can do a law degree as your first degree. I did not. I did maths, and then I did what we call the conversion course. So that's a little bit, I think, like you're doing a postgraduate degree in law, but for us, it's very practice focused. Now, it meant on the upside that the law firm that I was going to work for paid for the course, but on the downside, it meant that all I was geared up for was a career in commercial law. And indeed, that was the first sort of 5 years of my professional life. So this world, international law generally, and certainly international criminal law specifically, were not even on my radar at that point. And it was only after years in practice in commercial law, commercial litigation, and then a sort of dive into an LLM, and then a rebirth into ICL that I became aware of this. So I know this is probably something to talk about later, but what I was, say, sort of channeled into something, and I wasn't given the opportunity to hear about what was going on in this area. So I would just say to everyone, any opportunity you get to talk to people who are either familiar with this field or in this field, please do take it, because they will have some incredibly valuable information that certainly I was not privy to at a time when I would have loved to have heard it. So yeah, Kristen.
I would say for me, when I was in law school, yes and no, I imagined that I would be doing what I did now. I actually started sort of the opposite of the way Helen did. I knew about the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and I wanted to work there. And I went and I interned there when I was in law school, and I thought this is the only kind of international law, is the only kind of redress you can get for human rights abuses. And I was sort of doggedly pursuing just the international criminal tribunals. And then the end of law school, after I got my LLM, I was sort of exposed to the fact that there are many other ways that international justice can be sought and achieved. Sometimes it's through nonprofits, and it can even happen in commercial law firms in the United States. I really wasn't exposed to the fact that there are many different avenues to get to a similar goal, if your goal is to help promote a measure of justice for any group of people or any individual.
Thank you both. I love Helen's, discussion of her sort of reincarnation as an ICL lawyer. And I think Kristen essentially seems to be making a similar point, which is that there's just a lot more variety and many more avenues out there than it may seem in law school. So with that background in mind, then tell us, if you would, both of you, about the trajectory of your careers. How did you go from law school? And I think you both mentioned that you have LLMs, but let's start with your kind of base initial. Well, actually, Helen, you said you don't have actually a law degree. So what you have is because of the legal system of legal education in the UK, you have a degree in mathematics. And then you have the training course, the LPC, I think it is, that sort of transformed you into a practicing lawyer. But tell us how you both have LLMs. So tell us, I think, how you went from, what were the steps in your career journey going from LLM, I guess, Kristen, maybe starting with your JD, and then what were the steps along the way to reaching the point where you are now? Maybe Kristen.
Sure. So when I was in law school, I mentioned previously that I went and worked at the ICTY. I was very interested in international criminal law. The law school, I went to Pepperdine, so close to all of you at Loyola, and there were a smattering of human rights and international courses, but there were not many. And so I knew that I wanted more at the end of law school, and I knew that jobs that I thought that I wanted in a career for ICL, I was not prepared for at the end of law school, because I felt like I didn't really have that a deep enough background in international law in general, specifically international criminal law. I also knew that I didn't want to go and get an LLM where I just was going to use it to go into academia. I wanted to have some kind of practical, I wanted to be able to use the skills that I had from the LLM, in a practical career. And I also grew up, caveat, I grew up in Asia, I grew up in Indonesia. And so I went to Hong Kong and got my LLM in human rights there. It felt a little bit like going home. And I was with, a cohort of people who they worked for national human rights commissions. They worked, and just very practical jobs that kind of touch on human rights. And I felt like that program was what I needed to kind of get me started on my sort of international human rights legal career. But I didn't feel at the end of law school that I was ready for that quite yet. And so I'm very grateful for that extra year of training.
And then once you did the LLM in Hong Kong, take us through kind of the steps in your career journey from LLM to where you are now.
A lot of it's pure dumb luck and who you know, because I had a job with the US Department of Justice when I left Hong Kong, with the caveat that I passed a background check. And not a scary person, but I had lived outside the United States for too long, and I couldn't pass a background check because you have to have lived inside the United States for 3 of the last 5 years. I lived outside of the US. So I was back in the United States, no job. And I had a professor from Pepperdine, and she was doing human rights related cases in California state courts and California federal court. And so I sat in her office basically until she gave me a job. It took about 6 months, and I sat at the desk opposite hers, and I did whatever she wanted. And sooner or later, she said that I could stay. And quite frankly, the rest is history, because for the last 14 years or so, I've in some capacity worked with the same group of individuals that, who I sat in that office with 14 years ago. And we've done all kinds of really wonderful and interesting things. And so I would just say that I know that a lot has been said recently, I think, in law schools about, it's not always about connections anymore. You can get jobs more, it's more common to get jobs by applying to things online. I really do believe in the value of personal connections and who you know and keeping in touch, and really just dogged pursuit and being relentless and not giving up when you really want something.
Yeah. I like that. So a combination of luck and determination, it sounds like, were big factors in getting you to where you are now. And I would probably add also, I'm sure, a lot of hard work.
There's been a lot of long hours.
Helen, how about you? How did you what is your career trajectory? How did you get from, especially since you did mathematics as an undergraduate, and you said you were trained for a commercial law career in the UK, how did you then get from that to now being an experienced international criminal prosecutor?
I think probably to second everything that Kristen said, a lot of it is luck, it's connections, it's determination, it's hard work. It's also, just, I think for all of you, just being, doing your best at whatever work you're given. I'll get back to the trajectory in a second, but I think, if you end up in an internship, you will have a real eclectic mix of work given to you. Some of it will be, beautiful, pure law. other parts of it will be quite administrative. And I think whatever you're given, do a really good job and you know, prove yourself and show your worth. And I think that can take you a long way. But as to the trajectory, yeah, so as we said, maths degree, and then I did the year's conversion course, which is in England and Wales, not even the UK, in England and Wales, that is supposed to take you to the same level as those who have a law degree. And I think probably from a quality perspective it does, but from a quantity perspective it really does not. And so it was all the basic courses, you know, criminal, tort, equity and trust, property, you know, all those things that you would expect to do, and in fact that you are expected to do by our law society. And the nearest I got to international law at that point, of course, we were a part of the European Union when I was at law school, so we had to do EU law. It was a half course, it wasn't even a full course, and that was really the closest I got. And so, as I said earlier, this world was just not known to me at that point. And so I then went to do my 2-year training contract that we have to do, so where you're a trainee solicitor, in my case, in a law firm. And at the end of that, I qualified into the real estate litigation team. So it was commercial real estate. They sort of overlapped a little bit. And I was incredibly lucky to get on a really interesting case, because you can probably imagine they don't come up much in real estate litigation. And we ended up taking the case to what was then the House of Lords, now the Supreme Court. And so I can say I got genuinely very good work, but I'd been there about 3.5 years, and I got to the point where I knew I had to put my heart and soul into it and go on the partner track and do all of those things or leave. And there were so many things that were not comfortable for me. I can elaborate if you'd like me to, but needless to say, I got out, and that's when I went and did my LLM at Cambridge in the UK. And that course is one of those, it's very free. You take 4 electives, but they can be anything. So I ended, because I knew I sort of wanted to move as best I could. I mean, I was very naive, but I knew I wanted to do international law. And that was, at that point, I was thinking more international environmental law, to be honest. And so that was one of the courses I took. And international criminal law, law of armed conflict. And then I took private international law as sort of a stepping stone between my 2 lives. And at that point, I still wasn't, I'll be honest, very focused. And the international criminal law lecturer came in one day and said, if anybody fancies a summer in The Hague, there's an internship going in chambers at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And so I thought, well, why not? And I had a few savings left from having worked, which was a bit of a godsend. And so I went to The Hague and I worked in Trial Chamber 2 at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which was working on the Charles Taylor case, the former president of Liberia. And I did 4.5 months internship, and then was lucky enough to be invited back. And so I left in left for Christmas essentially, and the following August I went back as a P1, so sort of the bottom rung on the ladder, but it's a start. And so then we were working on the judgment, and I stayed with a few ups and downs and some time in the US and all the rest of it, but essentially I stayed until we delivered the judgment in the Charles Taylor case. So I mean, again, fantastic experience. Should I stop there or keep going? I can keep.
Well, I think just to close the loop, so how did you go from the Special Court for Sierra Leone to where you are now, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia?
Okay, so I left the Special Court for Sierra Leone in July 2012. And then I went back to Cambridge, and I was doing a mixture of things. So I, for a couple of years, ended up on a sort of more academic track. So I was teaching at Cambridge on the LLM, which was fantastic. I loved that. And I was also helping to write a book, imaginatively titled International Criminal Law. And so sort of parallel tracks for a couple of years. And then I received an email from the senior legal officer, or the former senior legal officer from the Special Court of Sierra Leone, under whom I'd worked in the trial chamber. And he said, Nick Cumgen, so that's was the international co-prosecutor at the CCC at the time, is looking for someone to help with some brief writing. It'll be, how do you fancy 3 months in Phnom Penh? And so this was at the end of 2014, and I nervously said yes, and came to Phnom Penh for 3 months, and that was almost 8 years ago. So I loved it so much. I loved the work, the team, and so at the end of those 3 months, a more permanent position came up, and I applied and was successful, and yeah, life has continued since then.
Yeah. That's great. So something that I hear from both of you really is that there was kind of a period of some searching and some sort of uncertainty about where exactly your career was going, what exactly you might be doing, and combined with some element of like, gee, I'm not sure this is quite the thing for me. And then at some point, something sort of fell into place and you found yourselves in a spot that was comfortable, or at least comfortable enough to want to stay and continue with it and sort of deepen your, involvement and your engagement, and really sort of focus in on that practice area. Let me ask you this now, and I will say also, I want to make sure to leave time at the end of this for any questions from students. So if you have those questions, I think maybe another 15 minutes or so, maybe by about 5:45, I'd like to open it up to student questions, which you can either put in the chat, or of course, at that point, we'll ask for questions, and you're welcome to turn on your cameras and ask your question directly. So I'm wondering then, maybe this would be it would be a good segue then, talking about the fact that you both found yourselves kind of landed at a spot that you enjoyed. What do you enjoy most about this kind of work? What prompted you maybe to stay at the particular job that you were at? Because they're very different, really, the kinds of work that you're describing. Helen, you're working at a criminal prosecutor's office. And while we're talking about atrocity crimes and, massive prosecutions that span years and years, at the end of the day, still you're a prosecutor. Whereas Kristen, you are a civil litigator with an active practice that includes atrocity-related work, but also, I think, some other types of cases. So tell us, I think, what is it that, what do you enjoy most about this work, and also about the particular place that you landed?
I would say that I enjoy being able to utilize international law and human rights law in US courts in my practice. And I would say, why do I enjoy this? I enjoy it because the people that the cases are brought on behalf of, they matter, and they've been through some of the most horrific things that I could even imagine. And it's really hit home for me in my most recent case, because I've worked for so long on Holocaust property restitution or Armenian genocide era justice, where there's the distance of time between the atrocity and the work that you're doing. But the work that I've been working on for the last, the last couple of years, I'm working and interacting with actual survivors of genocide, and some of the most horrific things you can imagine. Having your fingernails pulled out in a ghost house, or having your genitals electrocuted, or watching all of your family shot right in front of you. And there's just it can't be that there's no justice for those individuals. It can't, and you know, if we're lucky, Helen in her next job will be able to prosecute Bashir at the ICC if he ever makes it all the way to The Hague. But for the people who, you know, whose lives were ruined by the al-Bashir regime, it's very imperfect justice, the justice that American courts offer. What you can offer in civil, in terms of civil redress, is money, and money is never going to make a person whole, and it's never going to fix the land that they left and the family and the culture that they left behind. But it is a way to provide some kind of justice to these survivors, and that keeps me going every day. And you know, I've never wanted to quit.
That's great. It's very inspiring to hear you talk about it. I guess just a quick follow-up would be, you know, you said that when you first were in law school, you were really focused on doing international criminal law at an international criminal tribunal, but now you're doing civil litigation in a U.S. court. Can you talk just a little bit about, you know, maybe what am I trying to say? Sort of how you came to feel that actually working, you know, as a U.S. trained lawyer, how you came to feel that working in a U.S. domestic context would still sort of satisfy that initial urge that you had?
Sure. So I think my initial urge was really driven by a very strong sense of personal justice. And I think back when I only knew about international criminal tribunals, the ad hoc tribunals and the ICC, I thought that that was the only place you could go to sort of mete out redress. And what I have found over the last 15 years is there are many, many fora for finding justice. And it can be in a US court. There are also, I've worked on Holocaust era property restitution cases in foreign domestic courts, for example, in Poland. And so there's US courts, there's foreign domestic courts, there are foundations and government programs in many different countries that run restitution regimes, or some sort of compensation regime in recognition of slave labor or some other kind of atrocity. And I think my eyes have been opened up, and I've been so much further exposed to the many ways and locations that you can seek and promote and get justice. So I am a part of me will always wish I were part of an international criminal tribunal, but I really do believe in the work that I do here in US courts.
And so, Helen, as someone who does work at an international criminal tribunal, tell us, what do you enjoy about the work? And maybe since you also practice domestically, how is it different from domestic practice?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, there's a few aspects to the answer, because I mean, talking first about what I do here, from a very personal perspective, it doesn't feel like work anymore. I get up in the morning, and don't get me wrong, the hours are just as long as commercial practice, if not longer. I have to cycle 18 kilometers every day to the other side of the city, which is not easy. And we've ended up sleeping in our offices, all of those things. But it never feels like work. And that's because, for the same reasons that Kristen was saying, that it's because it matters. I mean, particularly being here in Cambodia, I mean, obviously one of the upsides of a hybrid tribunal is that you are in the country itself. And there is, I think, it's no exaggeration to say that there's no one in Cambodia that wasn't touched in some way, either directly or indirectly, by the Khmer Rouge regime. And so you are bringing justice as best you can. I mean, it's never perfect, but bringing justice as best you can for the community that you live in, the people on the street outside, your colleagues. I mean, in my team, okay, many of them have just left, but in the team that I think of, we have many direct victims, one of whom his parents were both killed in S21, and another was, as an 8-year-old during the regime, beaten unconscious in a security center. And those are my colleagues, and you know, those are who I'm, among others, millions of others who I'm working for, and just knowing that that genuinely really matters to them just makes such a difference. And you know, you asked about the commercial law. Of course, you know, you're working for people still, but I always had this sense that the bottom line was money, whereas here, obviously, it's very, very different. And I think the other aspect, which is sort of more academic and less human, is that because it's such a new area of law in some ways, I feel I can be very legally creative in a way that I couldn't in my domestic jurisdiction. I mean, we're on the front line of developing the law, and particularly as prosecutors, you know, we push, and then sometimes the judges push back and sometimes they don't. And so, you know, developing the law to truly reflect, you know, the gravity of the crimes and making sure that justice is delivered and convictions are secured. Yeah, it's exciting. It's genuinely incredibly interesting. I mean, as I mentioned, I've been in academia before I came here, which was incredibly helpful, sort of having the tools to do this job. But it also just gave me an appetite for that side of things as well. So I tend to get very, I mean, obviously I do an incredible amount of factual work, but I do tend to get involved particularly in the legal issues, which I love. So.
Yeah. Great. So it sounds like for both of you, the work is both personally fulfilling as well as kind of, you know, intellectually challenging, and it really engages your whole self. There's, Helen, you mentioned the amount of creativity that's required, and the sort of excitement of the creative, kind of finding creative arguments to make on behalf of, well, your clients. I suppose, Helen, for you, your client really is sort of the people of the world. If you're prosecuting, you know, these crimes that, you know, sometimes in their very definition implicate all of humanity. And Kristen, for you, on behalf of your individual clients, trying to figure out ways to, you know, push the law forward and really bring cases in U.S. courts that perhaps U.S. judges are not accustomed to seeing, but that nevertheless, there is a forum here and there are avenues for redress here. So that's really exciting. Let me ask you then, maybe one more question, and then we'll see if we can open it up for some student questions. What skills would you say are necessary for success in your work in this field?
I would say for me, it's very similar to all of the skills you would need to be a litigator in different, you know, in a different field in the United States. I think writing is very important. Oral advocacy is very important. And just to echo something that Helen said earlier, whatever skill is required of the task that you're given, no matter how menial it is, if it's stapling, if it's pulling cases, if it's doing something that you think a paralegal or a secretary should do, that's the skill that you should be really good at right then. Because if you show competency in the small things, then you'll be given, you know, given more concrete and more meaty things in the future. And I spent many years doing things that you know I wouldn't have thought of in law school as being real law work, and it's just it's part of the job. And if you do that well, then you get to do the really like the creative legal arguments, and then you get to push the limits of the law. And that's something worth working towards and building a career on.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't a lot to add actually, because I mean, that's spot on. I know this wasn't your direct question, but just to say briefly, yeah, I mean, in human rights law, unlike my former life, there are no secretaries. Like, there is no one else to do the stuff for you. So day to day, yes, I get to, you know, create the new legal arguments, but I also have to do site checking. I have to do, like, when we file a brief, I have to check personally every footnote, make sure it's perfect, like the works. I type, like, everything I do myself, from beginning to end. But to go back to sort of tie that into the question, yeah, obviously, being a good, and a lot of this stuff is transferable. So this is, I think, also tied to an earlier sort of perhaps learning point, is that there is no one career trajectory. And, you know, if you do find yourself in something that, you know, you feel is not directly part of the plan, I can guarantee you'll be learning transferable skills that you will be able to use. So yeah, absolutely, writing oral advocacy is incredibly important, making sure that you can make concise legal arguments. So, you know, communication in many, many ways. Clearly, you need to have a good technical knowledge of the law, but you've also got to be able to communicate that. But the other thing, which I think comes out of everything that Kristen and I have both said, is attention to detail. It's, I think, often underestimated how important accuracy is, because you know, in many of our briefs, you'll have the body text, which is all your lovely legal argumentation. But then I mentioned the site checking, the footnotes. If you're citing an authority, you have to cite the right authority. That has to be absolutely on point, and you obviously have to do it correctly. And having been in chambers, I've seen it from the other side, that I've had briefs in, and I look at the footnote and I think, well, that has nothing to do with the proposition. It doesn't support the proposition. It's useless. And so when you're the one creating those briefs, you have to make sure you're spot on. And so I would, yeah, add attention to detail to the list, which again can be gained in really any work that you do. Yeah.
Those are great suggestions, great advice. And I would also add advice that I also give to my clinic students in the Genocide Justice Clinic, which is a fantastic way for any of you that are listening to this conversation to gain some of those skills as well. Shameless plug. Okay, so why don't we open it up? If any of you have questions you'd like to ask, please feel free to write them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and turn your camera on and just ask our panelists yourselves. Yeah, I think Emily.
Hi, thank you both so much for your time. I think my question is, I know international law and just human rights law in general is very nuanced, but in terms of, like, you guys are obviously dealing with very atrocious and heinous crimes. Like, how was that at first, sort of like having to read about that and apply the law in that, like, sense? Was, like, that difficult to carry home, and that you're okay with practicing? Like, obviously you guys have both practiced for a while now dealing with all that. So do you, like, sort of, I guess my question is, do you become, like, desensitized to that sort of thing, or how do you deal with that? Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah. I think for me, I mean, you never get completely desensitized, but I personally, I mean, my sort of coping mechanism, because I feel at least you have to have one, because as you say, you're seeing humanity at its worst on a day-to-day basis, and some of the graphic evidence that you receive it disturbs you, it's bound to. And I think for me, one of the coping mechanisms was to focus very much on, what am I here for? What am I trying to prove? And sort of associating those facts, however horrendous, with the legal elements of the crimes, just to try and, I mean, obviously what I'm here for is to prosecute. And so to be successful, that's my job. And so focusing on that rather than sort of getting overwhelmed by the graphic detail was sort of my way of dealing with that. But I think I have two caveats. First of all, I genuinely don't think within the this isn't supposed to be my forum for complaint, but within the United Nations particularly, there's no counseling service, there's no nothing. And that's something that I'm actually going to actively working towards, because I do think that international criminal lawyers and those working in atrocity crimes more generally, there is the potential for us to be traumatized. And I think having a support mechanism, professional support mechanism, is something that is imperative. The other thing I would say is sometimes, whilst I have these coping mechanisms myself, sometimes they don't work. And there was one time in particular that I was preparing for some oral submissions to the pretrial chamber at the extraordinary chambers. And it was in case 3, which, as you may know, is a case that's been dismissed. And this was at the point where we were trying to persuade the judges of the pretrial chamber to send the matter to trial. And so there were a lot of very procedural, dry arguments that I had to make. So in some ways you might say that's the easy bit. But then I wanted to say to the judges, look, if you dismiss this case, these are the victims you're letting down. And so I'd prepared this speech of some of the most horrific crimes that were incorporated in that particular case. And we did a practice run, and I'm so glad we did. We did a practice run in the office, and I got through less than a sentence and I broke down. And so I then spent the weekend practicing and practicing and practicing, because I knew that I couldn't do that in front of the judges. And I actually wrote a sort of alternative ending just in case I felt myself going. So yeah, it's not perfect. But everything we've talked about so far today about how much meaning this work has, obviously, it's slightly double-edged, but that's what keeps you going. I really am doing this for these people, for to give them some measure of justice, and so keeping that in mind helps. Okay, sorry.
I would say that I have sort of a similar philosophy to Helen. I think the laying out of really horrific crimes in briefs or in front of the judge, it's sort of a means to an end. The end being there is some kind of justice that's going to be achieved, however imperfect it is. But I will also say that I completely agree with Helen that there are severely lacking mechanisms, like for mental health mechanisms for lawyers who work in the atrocity field, and that became very clear to me in recent months when I, on a particular case, was in depositions with genocide survivors, and I had never seen people be treated so poorly by defense counsel in my entire life, and it was appalling, and it got me every single night. And I would call home and I'd call my family, and I would be crying. And if it's that devastating to me, you can only imagine how devastating it is to the actual plaintiff, who is the survivor who's telling their story. And so it puts into perspective that we can build all of these walls up, and we can say that we can try to distance ourselves from the horrible facts, or we can write them down and try not to get emotional about them. But when people tell their stories, and when people tell you all of the horrible things that have happened, it's really hard not to get emotional. It's really hard not to take it home. But that makes you work even harder, and it makes you want to win and prevail that much more.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Emily. Michelle.
Hi, I'm so sorry if my dog makes noise for some reason. She chose like right now that she needed to be nice and rowdy. But I just wanted to thank you guys so much for taking the time to do this. This has been incredible for me to listen to. I'm actually born and raised in the Philippines, and I came here to the United States pretty recently to pursue my JD. And so hearing about, I don't know how familiar you are with the Philippines and what's going on right now, but we just re-elected the son of the dictator who, plunged our country into all sorts of economic debt this year. And so I'm actually in Loyola's International Human Rights Practicum, and I'm also taking International Protection of Human Rights with Professor Romano. And something that I'm finding in the couple of weeks that I've been in this world is how frustrating it can get at times, especially when you talk about governments that are just very difficult, particularly with the United Nations. And so I'm just wondering how you deal with that, and what might, I know we talked about what you enjoy most about the job. So I guess I'm wondering how you deal with the frustrations of the job. And yeah, I'll stop there. And I have one more after that.
Should I go? So sometimes, if we're honest, the ECCC can be the very definition of frustration. I just mentioned case 3 in my last answer. So you may know, I've got to be diplomatic about this, but cases 3 and 4 were dismissed, and it has been said, for example, in the final dissent from Judge Clark, that it was clear from the beginning that the government of Cambodia was determined that these cases would not go ahead. And indeed, that was finally what happened. We got to the indictment stage, but then we didn't succeed in getting it to trial. And so the people involved, I mean, the ostensible reason for not sending them to trial was because these people were not within the personal jurisdiction of the ECCC. They weren't senior or most responsible. Well, in the case of case 3, he couldn't have been much more senior. He was essentially running the whole military structure. And in case 4, we were talking about, among others, a guy who led the genocide of the Cham people. So, for example. So incredibly frustrating that those cases did not go to trial. They thoroughly deserved to in the International Prosecutor's submission. And yeah, how to deal with that? It's hard. I mean, obviously, the frustration is motivating in a sense that we fought and we fought and we fought to get these cases to trial. And when it didn't happen, it was incredibly demoralizing. I mean, you think of a lot of the other tribunals, and there's a measure of success that we were just politically prevented from. And so that was incredibly frustrating. And I think I don't think I haven't fully dealt with it, if I'm completely honest. I will be forever more frustrated. I don't think I'll ever quite come to terms with it, but it all the way through that procedure, and in my future, it has given me a fire in my belly, because I want to keep fighting to make sure that these frustrations happen less and less. So I think that's an imperfect answer, but it's all I can say. Kristen.
Sure. I think I also may not answer the question perfectly, but the frustrations in my practice arise from the sovereign clients, like you were mentioning the Philippines. Well, we have a lot of diplomatic deadbeat defendants that have the most expensive counsel, and they have dozens of lawyers, and we're outgunned every single time. We're outmanned. It's always David and Goliath. We have to be better on a leaner team, and we have to win every single thing in order to win. And the defendants only have to win once, and they're better funded. They have bigger, they have bigger legal teams, but but the satisfaction for me comes in, they're not smarter. They pay more for their lawyers and they have more of them, but they're not making better arguments. And it's incredibly satisfying when you know that you're the better attorney and the judge finds your argument to be the better one, because it's, you know, it's more fully fleshed out, and it's, you know, it's got a better basis. It doesn't always happen. Judges are sometimes sort of subconsciously or consciously biased towards big law firms and you know, not having sovereign defendants in US courts. But I get really fired up in trying to be the David beating the Goliath.
I love that. Tiny but mighty. I think maybe we have time for just one more quick question from Michelle.
I don't know if it'll be quick, but you both have mentioned imperfections and in international law, and so I guess I wonder what you think would be the best steps taken to kind of make the system a little bit more perfect. I know that that's a very big question, so I totally understand if we don't have the time for it right now. But I guess that's just one of the things that I'm wondering. You know, I come from a very international background, and having seen all of that, it's just kind of one of the things that I'm trying to forge a path towards, and among, you know, being a Filipino living in the United States, and so in the legal profession. And so I guess I wonder what would be the best improvements or the most needed improvements to the systems that you both operate in. I know that's a big one, so really, if we don't have time for it, that's totally fine.
I would just, all I can think of, and it's a really pie in the sky rectification, would be to take politics out of international law. It's impossible, but that would make it a lot better. I know when I was working at the ICTY, Radovan Karadzic was brought in to be imprisoned in The Hague at the time I was working there, and you know, everyone knew where he was. They knew where he was for years. He was sort of hiding in plain sight, but nobody had the political will to bring him in the same way that no one has been able to bring Bashir into The Hague to face his charges at the ICC. There's not the political will, right? There are tons of competent prosecutors, and Helen will be one of them, that can prosecute these international criminals, but the politics gets in the way. There's not the political will, and so that would be my way to make it more perfect, but that's never going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I've just described politics getting in the way of our prosecutions. I couldn't agree more. And of course, you know, the role of the Security Council with its 5 members with a veto, I mean, it's always that there's so many imperfections, human imperfections, but also institutional imperfections. And it's very often a mixture of both, I think. So improvement, yeah, I mean, we're calling for an overhaul of the system, which is, yeah, that's big for a Wednesday morning. I think, I don't know, was it Ruth Bader Ginsburg that made the point that, you know, you don't win on these things overnight, that it's small victories that get you to the finish line. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to be a part of the system. I mean, I mentioned earlier about, you know, being legally creative and pushing boundaries, and I think that's what we have to do as individuals, is to constantly make small improvements. And, you know, hopefully eventually the walls will fall. But yeah, I wish I did. I have no magic bullet, but.
Yeah. Well, it puts me in mind of one of my favorite mottos from one of my legal heroes, Ben Ferencz, the still living 102-year-old Nuremberg prosecutor, when he was 27 years old, stood up in a courtroom for the very first time and secured a conviction of the Nazi Einsatzgruppen leaders. And what he has said that is so inspiring, just 3 little words, but they mean everything: never give up, never give up. I often think of those words when it seems like all is lost, but if he can do it, so can I. With that, I would just give a very warm thank you to both Kristen and Helen. This has been a really terrific conversation. So insightful, so helpful, so much wisdom and experience from the two of you. Thank you so much. And I will just make my last shameless plug for the clinic, the Genocide Justice Clinic. If you're interested in this kind of work, even just as something to make a part of your law school career, even if it's not something you want to, you think you want to have a full career in after you graduate, come check us out tomorrow. And whether you do or not, you're always welcome to come talk to me about this kind of law or any other aspect of international law. I love talking to students and getting people interested in this field that I'm so passionate about. So my door is always open. Thank you to all of you. Thank you again to Helen and Kristen and the CDO for co-organizing. Take care.